Second John is written to the chosen lady about the same time as First John. The chosen lady may refer to a person, a personal friend of John, or a local church. And the theme of Second John is to guard against false teaching. Third John is written to Gaius, an early church leader. This letter is less theological and more rational and administrative in nature. And the theme of Third John is to support missionaries who are passing through. Jude, well, the author is Jude, the half-brother of Jesus, who became a believer only after the resurrection. He only calls himself the brother of James. The date of writing for this one is 67 to 80, and the purpose is that he sets out to write a theology, but shifts to asking them to contend earnestly for the faith. There is an issue of the relationship of Jude to 2 Peter. One is that they both use a common source because they share so much material in common. Another is that Peter used Jude in writing his letter, or that Jude used Peter in writing his letter. But in this day, there was not such a sense of individual property rights as we have now. There was more of a collective mentality, and so there was no sense of taking individual credit for things and plagiarism like we have today. Jude also quotes from the apocryphal book 1 Enoch in verse 14 and the Assumption of Moses in verse 9. Revelation. I've taken a whole class in the book of Revelation. My professor came into seminary class on the first day of the book of the class on the book of Revelation, and he had a stack of books, and he plopped them down on the desk in front of the class, and he said, "There are as many interpretations of Revelation as there are interpreters." And I think that is really a good observation. It bothers me when people say, "Do you interpret the Bible literally?" Only when it's meant to be literal, and lots of Revelation is symbolic. So the debate is about what do the symbols mean. Scholars are not sure which John wrote this, possibly the same author as the Gospels and the Epistles. Revelation's style is very different to the other works of John, but so is the content. So it's not hard to believe that the style might be different because of the visions that John is having. I think John the Apostle wrote it. One tradition says that John was actually boiled in oil by Nero, but he survived and was exiled to Patmos. Now that sounds like a really awful method of torture, and I'm not sure from the early church tradition if that means that he survived miraculously, was delivered, and it scared Nero so bad that he exiled him to Patmos, but that seems likely. The date of Revelation is associated with the persecution of Nero in 65. Nero burned Rome and blamed it on the Christians. The other alternative for the date is later, and this would be if it's associated with the persecution of the Roman Emperor Domitian between 81 and 96. But John lived long enough to write in either one of these dates. The recipients, well, it's addressed to 7 churches, and the theme is to assure believers of Christ's triumph in the end. The general characteristics, there's lots of symbolic language, dreams, visions, numbers. It involves demonic and celestial powers, and there's a prediction of catastrophic judgment for the wicked and divine deliverance for the good. Here are the churches of Revelation, and some of you may have been on this tour in modern-day Turkey. There's Laodicea, Philadelphia, Sardis, Thyatira, Pergamum, Smyrna, and Ephesus. First, some general interpretations of the book of Revelation. One school of thought is called the preterist school, and that is the symbolism relates only to that day and has no bearing on the future. The advantage is that it connects Revelation with the need of the day and its historical context. The disadvantage is that it does not allow for any kind of prophetic or predictive element. Then there's the idealist school of thought, and this says that Revelation is simply a symbolic picture of good and evil, and what is described are really just trends and ideals, but not literal events. The advantages of that view is that it focuses on the ethical and spiritual truth rather than symbolism that nobody can agree on. The disadvantages is that it takes the whole book out of the context of history. The historicist school outlines in symbolism the entire course of history from Pentecost to the return of the Lord. The advantages of the historicist school is that it returns Revelation to the realm of history. The disadvantage is that no one can agree. Some schools of thought within the historicist view, and all of these schools of thought are based on Romans chapter 20, verses 6 and 7. So let me read that. Some schools of thought within the historicist view. Well, first, I need to read Revelation 20, verses 6 and 7, because the different schools of thought all revolve around this passage. It says, "Blessed and holy are those who have part in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth." Okay, so it all revolves around the 1,000-year reign of Christ. The post-millennial view says the 1,000 years used in these verses is figurative of a long period between the ascent of Christ at the end of the Gospels and the return of Christ at the end of the age. So the triumph of the gospel will introduce the reign of peace, which will usher in his coming. So in other words, the world is going to get better and better until finally we're almost in a Garden of Eden type setting again, and then Christ will come again. The amillennial view is that there is no literal 1,000-year reign of Christ. Christ can return at any time, and when he will judge the world. The premillennial view is that Christ will return again, followed by a 1,000-year reign, and then there will be a rebellion and a final suppression of Satan, and finally a new heaven and earth. By the way, there's almost no one who still adheres to the post-millennial view that things will get better and better. This was popular at the beginning of the 1900s, late 1800s, but after World War II, almost all the post-millennialists were gone. Right now, probably the most popular view of Revelation among evangelical Christians is a premillennial view, or less so, the amillennial view. There are four basic visions of Revelation. First is the glorified Christ in chapters 1 through 3. Here Christ is strengthening the churches that faced persecution.